Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at a couple budget controllers. This is one of my favorite things to review, and we've had some really good releases so far this year. And we're going to take a look at these two in particular. We have a new version of the 8BitDo Ultimate controller. This one's called the 2C. This is a wireless controller with a USB dongle and has Hall effect sensors for their sticks as well as their triggers. And it also has a couple component upgrades that separate it from the other Ultimate controllers that were released previously. And we're going to compare it against the new GameSir Nova Lite. This one's been out for a couple months at this point, but it has Hall sensor joysticks and a bunch of connectivity options. And the crazy thing about these controllers is that when I say budget, I really do mean budget. You can get the 8BitDo one for $30 retail, and the GameSir one's only $25. And at this price point alone, these controllers are kind of crazy. If you think back to like the old Mad Catz days, you know, back when we used to get those third-party controllers and nobody wanted to use those, we are so far away from that at this point. Either way, even though they are cheap controllers, if you are thinking about picking one up, I want to make sure that you buy the best one possible for you. And so in this video, we'll do a deep dive with all the things that make each of these controllers good and why you might want one over the other. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, before we jump too far into the details with each of these controllers, I did want to give a quick overview in terms of connectivity. And if you're trying to decide between these two, this might help weed things out right here in the beginning. Now, both of the controllers do have wireless USB dongles, so you can plug those into either a Windows or Linux computer and it should work just fine. You can also just plug them in with a USB cable if you wanted to play them wired. In addition, both of these controllers are capable of Bluetooth, but in different ways. Both controllers can connect to Android devices no problem, but that's the only thing that the Bluetooth on the Ultimate 2C can connect to right now. Meanwhile, on the Nova Lite, it can connect with basically anything via Bluetooth, so Windows, Linux, Android, Apple, as well as Nintendo Switch. And we are going to connect to each of these platforms in this video, but I wanted to give you a heads up before we start diving into each of the individual controllers. Okay, let's start with GameSir because these folks have been on a tear over the past 6 months or so. They've been releasing so many controllers I haven't been able to keep up. However, they keep sending them to me, so let's do a quick overview of some of the other options that we won't really address in this video. First of all, on the left, they have what they call their Collide line. These are going to be wired controllers made for Xbox. These are about $50 each, and they light up, and they also can connect directly to an Xbox console, unlike the others. And I have been testing one of them for a while now, and it's actually very solid, but you have to know what you're getting into in terms of wired connectivity. It'll also work with Windows, but again, you'll have to plug it in, so this is going to be better for more stationary scenarios. Either way, if you're looking for a cheaper Xbox controller that's really solid, I think that these two options are still good. Now on the middle side, we have the Nova controllers, and yeah, these sound a lot like the Nova Lite that we're reviewing here today. And these do have the same shape and overall feel, but the big difference here is these are made for Nintendo Switch. These are a little bit more expensive, they're $35 instead of $25, but they do have gyroscope as well as RGB lighting and digital triggers. In addition, the A, B, and XY pattern is suited for the Nintendo Switch, so this is full on like a Nintendo Switch controller replacement. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to what we're reviewing here today, which are going to be the Nova Lite controllers. And I've been testing these for quite a while now. You've probably seen them in some of my B-roll footage over the past couple months. And I've been using the white one, I really enjoy it, but I did leave the other one in its packaging so we could do an unboxing for this video. And the first thing you're probably going to notice, when GameSir sent this over for review, the packaging got totally beat up. But the silver lining here is that the outer box doesn't really matter because the controller itself is secured within a hardshell case. And this is probably one of the more surprising discoveries in checking out this controller because you often will not see these hardshell cases even with more expensive controllers. And another nice thing, besides just protecting the controller itself, it actually has a space for the 2.4 GHz wireless dongle. This is also the first time I've seen this with a hardshell case, and I think it's really innovative. One of my biggest complaints about reviewing other controllers like this is that it's so easy to lose these dongles, and so this just kind of keeps it into place. And so it almost feels like this is the ultimate travel controller. You can throw it in your backpack or suitcase and not worry about it getting beat up, and you're also not going to lose that dongle, which is really handy. Anyway, looking at the controller itself, first impressions for me at least is that it looks a lot like a Google Stadia controller. I'm not sure if you remember those, but I happen to have one of them, so let's do a quick comparison between the two. And yeah, sure enough, I think that they are very similar looking, all things considered. Now the Stadia controller is a little bit different in design. For example, it's more rounded, but then also has a more PlayStation style thumb layout. And so I wouldn't call it an apples to apples comparison, but yeah, they're very similar, more like an apples to orange. Speaking of which, the orange accents between the two are a little bit different as well. The GameSir controller's got a darker orange to it. And honestly, I think that one looks better anyway. Now, in terms of overall shape and feel, I would say that this is more akin to an Xbox controller. It has that A-frame shape to it that angles your elbows out and then your fingers in, and I really like that. So I think if you are familiar with an Xbox controller, you'll be right at home with the Nova Lite. Let's go ahead and start taking a look at the components, starting with the analog sticks. Now first, these are Hall sensor sticks. In fact, this is the cheapest controller you can get with these type of sticks in it. And the sticks themselves feel great, and I'm not surprised because GameSir keeps making controllers better and better. The cap has a nice grippy outer rim to it, and we have a wide range of motion as well. In fact, when doing a side-by-side comparison with an Xbox Series controller, it is a very similar feel, but with one minor difference. And that is, it feels like the resistance on an Xbox controller is a little bit more prominent than on the GameSir Nova Lite. And it's a very subtle thing, and the only reason I'm even noticing it is because I'm testing them both at the same time. Regardless, I think they both feel great, but the GameSir one does feel a little bit lighter to the touch. Another difference between this and an Xbox controller is the center divot. This one has a little bit of a bump to it, very similar to what you would find on a PlayStation controller as opposed to the Xbox Series controller. Personally, I don't really mind it either way, but I know there are a lot of people who are in one camp or the other. Here's a close-up look at an Xbox controller so you can see that very concave shape right there in the center. And by contrast, the Nova Lite has a little bit of a bump there. Honestly, I don't really notice one way or another, but if you care about this, then this is going to be the difference. Let's talk a little bit about the D-pad. We'll test this one later when we get to the actual 8BitDo controller. For now, I want to mention that yeah, it's a rubber membrane connection, feels really good and classic. It has a good amount of pivot to it, and the travel feels just about perfect. This is a good classic or just standard style D-pad. Again, I'm not surprised because GameSir has been making very good D-pads for quite some time. It's a similar story with these face buttons. They are also rubber membrane and have a nice tactile feel to them. The buttons themselves are somewhat flat but rounded at the sides, and they also have a matte texture to them. And again, that's very similar to the overall feel of the Google Stadia controller as well. The big difference that I noticed between the two is that the Stadia controller is a little bit more loose feeling, like there's a little bit more play with the buttons themselves. They wiggle left and right. The buttons on the Nova Lite feel better tuned in that they don't have a lot of wiggle to them, and so they feel nice and solid. All in all, when it comes to your main buttons on the front, everything feels well crafted. The analog sticks, D-pad, face buttons, they all work together really well. Looking at the rest of the front, up top we have our select and start buttons on each side. Below that, we have a screenshot button, which will also be used to reset any pairing. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Above that, we have the home button, so pressing this will bring up like the Xbox menu, for example, but I like to call this the chicken button just because it has the GameSir logo on it. And then finally on the bottom, we have what they call the M button, and this is their function button for a bunch of different things within its own software. And here's a quick look at their online user manual so you can see which button combinations do what. So essentially pressing the M button and up and down will adjust the vibration intensity, and you can also use the M button to remove the dead zone around the sticks, and then also you can change out the AB and XY pattern. And really when it comes to special features, this is about it. There's not a lot going on with this controller, which I kind of like. I like the simplicity of this $25 option. Anyway, let's move on and talk about the top buttons, our bumpers and triggers. Now the bumpers are a lot like the D-pad and face buttons. They have a kind of rubber connection to them, so they feel more classic and retro as opposed to micro switchy. And I do like the feel of them. They're a little bit lighter to the touch. They remind me a bit of a PS4's controller, and so I like that. Speaking of which, the triggers are also very reminiscent of a DualShock controller as well. These are not Hall sensor, but they still have a full analog input, and they just have a nice trigger sort of feel to them. They also remind me of the Google Stadia controller, although those are a little bit longer, and I like the short kind of trigger feel of the GameSir one instead. And then finally, let's take a look at the back. Not a lot going on here, but I did want to mention the texture of the plastic feels really good. The main part of the controller just has a gritty kind of textured plastic, and then we also have some bumpy grips on each end. And both of these are a hard plastic, which means they're going to be easy to clean and will probably stay really nice and premium for years to come. And finally, up top, we have a USB-C port for wired connectivity as well as charging. Just bear in mind that this controller does not come with its own cable. Now, between the two, I was kind of torn about the colors. I thought that I was going to like the white one the most. That's why I opened it first. However, after unboxing the purple one, I think I actually like that one better. I like the contrast of the purple as well as the orange. And so I think I surprised myself between the two in that I prefer the purple one over the white, even though initially I thought that the white panda one would totally be it. So now let's move on to the other one one we're comparing today, which is going to be the 8BitDo Ultimate 2C wireless controller. And in full disclosure, even though 8BitDo often will send me their controllers for review, this one was not sent over, and so I just bought it myself. And honestly, I kind of don't mind that they aren't sending me controllers right now because they have released so many over the past year. Let's do a quick run through of all the different controller options that are similar to this one, because I think it's probably pretty confusing for most people. To start, we have the one we're reviewing today, the Ultimate 2C, which goes for $30 retail. This is their most recent release. I think it came out just a couple weeks ago, and it has 4 different color options. I decided to go with the green one, the one that has these really bright orange buttons. I thought it was just a unique color combination, so I wanted to see it myself. Now, for all intents and purposes, these controllers are an upgrade of a previous model that they released last year. And you can see in the description all of the things that have changed since previously. They now have a 1000 Hz polling rate, which should make for faster connectivity. They've also added Hall sensors to their joysticks and triggers, as well as a metal ring around their joysticks. In addition, they have 2 additional buttons, L4 and R4, which can be mapped to whatever you would like. They've also updated the shoulder buttons as well as the D-pad. We'll test those in a moment. And finally, they've added a physical toggle between 2.4 GHz as well as Bluetooth. Now here's a look at the previous model. Again, it looks very similar, but we had less color options to choose from. And as I'm making this video, they're still going for the same price of $30, so make sure that you pick up the one that you want when you buy it online. Now, in addition to these wireless 2.4 GHz models, we have a bunch of other options. Let's go over those really quickly. To start, there is a cheaper model available. It's a straight wired controller, and they've made an upgraded version of this one as well. And as far as I can tell, this is exactly the same as the other controller, other than the fact that this one is wired only, so no 2.4 GHz dongle. And this also is an upgraded version over their old wired controller, which also went for $20. Now, that's not to be confused with another wired option that they have, which was just called the Ultimate Wired controller. This one is very similar to the others, but had different color options and also worked with the Nintendo Switch. And this one went for a higher price point, about $35 MSRP. Now, we've got a bunch of other options, so let's keep going. So the next one, they have the Ultimate 2.4 GHz wireless controller. And the main differentiating factor with this one is that it came with a charging dock, which I really love. In fact, I did a whole roundup of all these controllers last year. I'll leave that video linked down below if you want to go further into this rabbit hole. Anyway, as you can see, this one is even more expensive. It's now $45, but nowadays it actually comes with Hall effect sensor joysticks, which is pretty great. And in general, this has been my most recommended controller just because I love that charging dock and it's still a reasonable price. Now, if you want to go even further up the ladder, there's a Bluetooth version as well. This one used to be $90, but nowadays it's only $70. The big difference here is this one is fully Bluetooth, so it can connect wirelessly to a Nintendo Switch, and it also has gyroscopic motion controls. And so that's a quick look at the all-around controllers, the ones that will work with multiple platforms, but we do have other options they've released as well. So bear with me because we have a few more to go through. The next one is going to be the Ultimate C controller that's made specifically for Switch. Now this one's unique because it's only $30, but it only works as a Nintendo Switch Pro controller. However, this does have some Switch-friendly features, including 6-axis motion control, some rumble, and you can also wake it from sleep. Another thing that makes this really great for Switch is it's the only one that I know of that has digital triggers, so you don't have to use the full analog motion since the Switch doesn't support it anyway. Now, if you want to use it for Xbox, we have some options for that as well. They have a new one that just came out, it's $35. This is the Ultimate C wired controller. This one is the only one among them that has RGB lights to it, but bear in mind, because it's a licensed Xbox controller, it's also going to be wired only. But one of the nice things about these Xbox controllers is they also will work with Windows. And this one is also an upgraded version of a previous model, which used to be $10 more. And then finally, there's also one that is like a total mishmash. This one is also a wired Xbox controller, but can also be used wirelessly with Windows. So it is kind of a mixture of all of them, and this one will set you back $70. Anyway, now that we've gone through the entire wild west when it comes to Ultimate controllers, let's focus on the one that we're going to be talking about here today. And again, this is the Ultimate 2C controller, which is only $30. Now inside the box, it's a very typical 8BitDo controller experience. The packaging looks very similar to all the other ones that I've seen from them before. This one does come with a USB-C cable, which can be used both for charging as well as wired connectivity. And then of course we have our 2.4 GHz wireless dongle, which is the one that I use most of the time. Now, it is interesting that between the two, we don't have a clear winner. If you need a USB cable, then obviously the 8BitDo one is going to be better, but I also don't like the fact that we have a loose dongle just kind of hanging out. Meanwhile, the GameSir controller has a hard shell case, which I think is awesome, and then also it can store that USB dongle, which I think is doubly awesome. But of course, you will have to supply your own USB cable, which may or may not be a big deal. Now, in terms of design, this is very typical of the 8BitDo Ultimate line. It seems like they're probably just using the exact same case for the most part. I've always found these controllers to be a unique mix between an Xbox-style controller as well as a PlayStation controller. It has a bit more of a squarish and blocked-off feel to it, which honestly makes the D-pad feel a little bit more natural to use. And the overall squarish design also reminds me a bit more of a PlayStation controller than an Xbox one. Now, first impressions when looking at the controller itself, I was just amazed at this color contrast. It almost feels like an elementary school student is the one who designed it, because it just has a really unique look to it. I figure a lot of people are going to think this is ugly, but I don't know, I like the fact that it stands out so much. Anyway, let's start taking a look at the components. To start, we have these analog sticks, and honestly, in terms of design, they are very similar to the GameSir ones. They also have a very grippy cap to them, and then that little bump in the center, much like a PlayStation controller. In addition, we have that metal ring around the joystick, which does give it a very smooth, gliding feel. And these sticks also feel very good. In fact, they're pretty similar to the GameSir one, but there are a couple key differences. The first is that yes, the 8BitDo controller has tangibly more resistance compared to the GameSir one. And so if you are looking for something with a little bit more forceful feedback, then the 8BitDo is going to be a better fit. However, I do want to emphasize that even though the GameSir one is very light to the touch, it has a much wider range of motion compared to the 8BitDo controller. And so yes, even though it is easier to move the analog stick left and right, you can actually move it overall further than the 8BitDo one. And so even though it is light to the touch, I feel like I have more control overall. It almost feels like there's a good 10 or 15% more motion with the analog stick, and I really like having a wide range like this, and so I prefer the GameSir one over the 8BitDo. But just bear in mind that I don't really mind having a lightweight joystick like this. To give you an example, I didn't mind them on the ROG Ally either. Either way, on their own, the joysticks on the 8BitDo controller are excellent. Now let's move on to the D-pad, which has had a significant change from previous models. And I'm not really sure how to describe this. It almost feels like it has a dome switch connection, but with a rubber membrane there as well. So it has a very soft kind of clicky feel to it, almost like a PS Vita D-pad. It also feels like it has a lot more give or play to it. If I move it to one direction or the other, there's a big gap in the case. And so instead of having a traditional pivot, it almost feels like this has a shift sort of feel to it. In addition, because we have that clicky dome switch connection, it doesn't have a lot of travel either. So I think, yeah, maybe the best way I can describe it is that if somebody put a Super Nintendo controller on top of a PS Vita and tried to use it that way. And when I first started testing it, I was really impressed. I was like, wow, they've actually got a clicky D-pad here. It feels really unique. By contrast, the GameSir controller just feels like a typical traditional rubber membrane, which is not a bad thing either. When it really comes down to it, it's all about the real-world use case. So we're going to do my traditional tests here. We'll start with the Contra test. So my goal here is to push down on the D-pad and then just slightly move it left and right and see if the character moves. And for me, this is a great indication of whether or not I'm going to get accidental diagonals when playing a platforming game like this. And even though I had high expectations for this new D-pad design, unfortunately, it completely fails the Contra test. Not only does the character move as soon as I shift it left or right while pressing down, but when actually playing the game, when trying to move around in various directions and then immediately duck to dodge a bullet, I did find myself actually moving diagonally sometimes instead of going straight down. So that, by definition, is an accidental diagonal, and I was able to notice it within just a few seconds of testing this game. And so I think that if you do plan on playing more retro-styled games, that can be actual retro games like this, or even more precision-based platformers like Celeste or Super Meat Boy, I'm not really sure this is going to be a great fit. I can tell you just from a few minutes of testing that I would not want to play Contra with this controller. Now the next test is going to be Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, so here I'm trying to see how easy it is to hit a diagonal when I want to. And logically, if we're getting accidental diagonals in Contra, that means we should get some very easy diagonals in Street Fighter. But I found that in my initial testing, I had a harder time than I expected playing Street Fighter games. But there are a couple things to bear in mind. Number one, I'm not used to playing a dome switch connection for a fighting game like this, and so I'm just naturally at a disadvantage. And it's not like I'm a great Street Fighter player anyway. However, even after a few rounds of playing, I didn't really see much improvement, and so that led me to think that I probably wouldn't want to play Street Fighter on this one anyway. This is all very subjective, especially when it comes to fighting games, but yeah, I also found this not to be particularly Hadoukenable or Shoryukenable. Now, just to make sure I'm not taking crazy pills here, I decided to test on an older 8BitDo controller, and I haven't been playing this controller that much over the past several months, and so as a result, this is probably as close to a brand new controller that I can get. And sure enough, this one does pass the Contra test. The character will wiggle a little bit left and right, but this is within the norms of what I would like to see with a rubber membrane D-pad. And so this older 8BitDo D-pad is exactly what I would expect, and I really like this for retro games. Moving over to Street Fighter, exact same experience. I was able to do my Hadoukens and Shoryukens no problem. But of course, keep in mind that I learned how to play Street Fighter on a Super Nintendo controller, and this is very similar to that, and so I'm right at home right here. Either way, in terms of using the D-pad for retro gaming, I did find that I like the older D-pad better than the new one. And then finally, let's try out the GameSir controller, and this one's very similar feeling to the older 8BitDo controller, so no surprises here. This one passed the Contra test no problem. If I wiggle it just a little bit, the character will not move, but then if I wiggle it even more, then you can see that yes, I can make the character move as well. And this is the range that I'm looking for in a D-pad when doing this test, so it is passing it no problem. Same thing with Street Fighter, this one plays really well. I am missing some inputs here and there, but like I said, I'm not super great at this game anyway. So long story short, even though I think the new 8BitDo D-pad will work just fine for modern games, those that don't really rely on a lot of D-pad inputs, when it comes to retro gaming, I find this to be a downgrade as opposed to an upgrade. Okay, moving on, let's talk about these face buttons, and these are very similar to others that we've seen from 8BitDo before. They're pretty similar to an Xbox Series controller, but a little bit more flat than rounded, but they do have that same kind of glossy texture to them as well. The buttons themselves feel nice and thunky and tight. In fact, other than the matte texture, it's almost identical to what you can find on the GameSir controller as well. I'm not really sure which one I like over the other. I like the grippiness of a glossy button, but I think the matte ones just feel very good as well. If anything, I would say that a matte button would fit the overall design better since everything else is of a matte texture. Taking a look at the rest of the front, in the center we have our menu or home button, and it also has an LED connectivity indicator. And to the left or right of the home button, we have our select and start. And then on the left, we have what they call the mapping button, as well as a mapping indicator, and then our star button, which is used for turbo. Let's move on and talk about these top buttons. We'll start with the bumpers. Now, these have also been changed since the previous models. These now have a micro switch connection to them. They are very clicky and very light to the touch. They feel a lot like on an Xbox Series controller, but a little bit less resistance in pressing them down. I think they feel very good. After that, we have our trigger buttons, which again are very similar in style to the PlayStation 4 DualShock controller. But also bear in mind, these are Hall sensor triggers unlike on the GameSir, and so they have a bit of a smoother feel to them overall. And it also feels like they have a little bit less resistance in them compared to the GameSir controller. If I had to categorize the two, I would say that the GameSir controller has more of a squeeze kind of mechanism to it, and by contrast, the 8BitDo controller has a bit more of a smooth gliding feel to it. I think they both feel good, but I do like the overall springiness of the GameSir controller just a little bit more. And then finally up top, we have those new mappable function buttons, L4 and R4. And these are really unique. I've seen a couple controllers that have placement like this, and it's always struck me as a little bit out of the way because my brain just never really thinks about pressing a third button up top like this. And I also found that in all of my testing, it just didn't register to me that these buttons were available options either. I think one of the things they could have done just to make it a little bit easier for us to transition to this type of button is to make them a little bit taller than the others. I think that the buttons are so out of the way that it would have been pretty easy to not press it accidentally. Anyway, let me show you how to map these in case you want to use them. First thing you want to do is press that mapping button, then whatever button on the controller you want to map it to, and then finally L4 or R4. So in this example, I'll map my L4 button to the A button or the jump button in Doom Eternal. And that's really all there is to it. From now on, it's going to remember that L4 is the A button. Let's map another button to R4 just to verify that this is how it works. So we're going to do map and then X and then R4, and that's going to now map it to the X button. So if I wanted to throw the chainsaw without taking my thumb off the right analog stick, I can do that by pressing R4. Now on some of the other older controllers, they have back paddles instead. And personally, I think I prefer having the buttons on the back as opposed to another place for my index fingers to press. That way I don't have to decide between the bumpers and the triggers and then the L4 and R4. Instead, I can just squeeze these whenever I would like. And I think this all is just going to come down to personal preference and whether or not you want to use these buttons in the first place. Of note, here's a quick comparison between the older button design for the bumpers and triggers compared to the new controller now. And I do like that the bumpers are larger, it makes them easier to find, but I never had a problem with that with the older controller either. So at the end of the day, I like the fact that they've added this functionality here, but I don't see myself using L4 or R4 in the future. And then finally, let's take a look at the back. We have this physical toggle button now between 2.4 gigahertz for the Wi-Fi dongle and then Bluetooth for Android. And in terms of plastic texture, it's very similar to the GameSir controller. So we have a nice textured plastic around most of the controller, and then we have these hard plastic grippy bumps here on the bottom. One last thing, up top we have our USB-C charging port, then a Bluetooth pairing button, and then also a charging indicator LED. Now in terms of weight, it's almost identical between the two. The GameSir is 210 grams, the 8BitDo is a little bit heavier at 218. What's interesting is that the GameSir has a larger battery of 600 milliamp hours as opposed to 480 milliamp hours with the 8BitDo. So that leads me to think that the plastics are just a little bit more of a heavier quality with the 8BitDo controller. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment because across the board, it does feel like the 8BitDo is a little bit more premium over the GameSir. And I think which one you prefer is really going to come down to your own gameplay style. If you plan on playing more modern games, something where extra function buttons will work out well, then I think the 8BitDo might be a better fit. For me personally, I really like the sheer simplicity of the GameSir at $25 with no extra fluff. And of course, D-pads are super important to me, especially with retro gaming, and so I think that the GameSir one is just a better fit for my own gameplay in general. So with all the design stuff out of the way, let's now move into actual gameplay and test everything, make sure it all works. We'll start by pairing Android via Bluetooth with the GameSir controller. And depending on what you're connecting to, you have to use a specific button combination. For Android, you have to press the A button, A for Android, then the chicken button. After that, it's going to flash a greenish yellow color. From there, you want to go into your Bluetooth settings in your Android device and then pair the new device. And if it only flashes every once in a while as opposed to rapidly, that means that you have to put it into pairing mode. To do that, you're going to press the chicken button and the button directly below that and hold it for a couple seconds until the light starts going more quickly. After that, your device should discover the controller, then you can tap on it and it should pair right up. Now, there is an Android app made by GameSir that will work with this controller. There's not a lot of things you can do in here. For example, you can't really configure anything, but you can do a gamepad test to make sure that all your buttons are working properly. In addition, as far as I can tell, this is the only way that you can upgrade the firmware. And as I'm making this video, my initial review units needed firmware upgrades, so I needed an Android device in order to upgrade my firmware. Either way, it's very easy to do, but that is kind of weird that you have to have an Android device in order to do this. Anyway, once I had it all up and running, absolutely no problem here. It gave me a good X input signal, and so every game that I tried worked perfectly fine. Now let's try the same thing, but with the 8BitDo controller. First thing, I want to switch the toggle over to Bluetooth, and then also tap the center button to turn on the controller. Now, if this one needs to go into pairing mode in order to be discovered, you have to press that button up top, just hold it for a couple seconds. And then same thing here, your Android device will find it and then you can connect right away. And again, the Bluetooth experience here was very good. It did feel a little bit more sluggish with the 8BitDo controller, but that might just have been a placebo effect. Either way, in terms of connecting Android with either of these controllers, it was super easy, so no problems here whatsoever. Let's move on and connect to Windows. Now, the GameSir is the only controller that will actually connect via Bluetooth, so let's do that one first. And this time to connect, we're going to press B and then the chicken button. The B is going to stand for blue this time around. After that, the chicken button will start flashing a blue color, and now it's ready to pair. Again, same thing here. We'll go into our settings, then Bluetooth configurations, and then add a device. The controller is just going to appear as wireless controller under Windows, but once you tap on it, it should connect. And one interesting note is that once I had it paired with my Windows machine, it showed up as a PS4 controller. Long story short, once I had that all connected up, everything worked really well. I didn't have any sort of connectivity issues, and it felt very snappy and responsive. So if you are looking for a Bluetooth controller in particular to use with a Windows machine, this is going to be great. And bear in mind that the 8BitDo controller cannot do Bluetooth to Windows like this. So now let's move on and use the 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi dongle. And of note, because I'm using my ROG Ally X that has USB-C input, I have to use a USB-C adapter. Either way, pairing this up is also super simple, so we will plug this into our machine. And from there, we're going to press and hold the X button and then the chicken button. Anyway, long story short, yes, in terms of connectivity with the wireless dongle, I had no problems getting it all spun up. However, there was one connectivity bug that I noticed, which we'll talk about here in a moment, but before that, let's move on to the 8BitDo controller. So the setup process here is going to be basically identical. So plug in your 2.4 GHz dongle into your Windows PC, and then also make sure that your switch on the back is toggled to 2.4 GHz. From there, just power the controller on and it should connect directly to the dongle and everything should be right as rain. So yeah, when it comes to connecting to Windows, especially with this dongle, it works really well, but it makes sense because this is probably the primary way you'll be connecting with either of these controllers with a Windows PC. You could also just plug it directly via USB cable if you wanted to have a wired setup as well. So now let's move over to the Steam Deck and try it out on a Linux-based operating system, and thankfully the setup is going to be exactly the same. So just plug in your dongle, turn on the controller, and everything should be plug and play. And in terms of just overall connection speed and reliability, I found that with both controllers, the 2.4 GHz dongle was super solid. Everything felt very stable. And I didn't really detect any sort of input lag either. And as expected, setting it up with the GameSir controller was the exact same experience. Just plug it in, turn it on, and it should work. However, one thing I noticed notice is after connecting with the dongle, my green light would turn to red. And when looking at my Steam settings, it's because the controller is being picked up as a Nintendo Switch Pro controller. And that is definitely not a good thing, because that means that the analog inputs on the triggers would register as a digital input instead. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I said that I found a connectivity bug. Because if you look at their website as well as in their instruction manual, they say that you can press the select and start button for 2 seconds, and it should switch between X input, Nintendo Switch Pro, as well as Android. However, I tried a ton of different combinations, including the select and start that they mentioned, and nothing changes the input mode at all. And I'm not sure what's going on here. This all happened after I made my firmware upgrade. Like I mentioned before, I was using the white controller for months with various videos and it never switched over to Nintendo Switch mode. So I sent an email over to GameSir and asked them, what's going on with this, but it's the weekend and so I don't expect them to answer right away. But when I do get an update, I'll be sure to leave it in a pinned comment because I think this is just a software bug at this point. Another thing I noticed when using it with the Steam Deck in particular is that my A, B, and XY buttons were swapped over like on a Nintendo Switch controller. Thankfully, that's also a pretty easy fix. All you have to do is press the M and A button for a couple seconds and then it'll swap it over to the regular Xbox layout. So that unfortunately is one disadvantage I've noticed, is this weird software bug that's happening with my wireless dongle right now. So for now, what I'm doing to get around this problem is that I'm just using my GameSir controller in Bluetooth mode because this will work just fine on Windows and on the Steam Deck. I personally prefer to use a wireless dongle just because I love that plug and play experience, but the nice thing is that the Bluetooth connection is super easy to set up, and then once it's done, you're basically good to go. And like I mentioned, as soon as I hear back from GameSir, I'll leave this in a pinned comment. I'm hoping that a software update will be coming down the line. Now, one thing I find pretty interesting is that if I try to connect to a different device using Bluetooth on the 8BitDo controller, it will connect. So for example, if I try to pair it with my Steam Deck, it will actually connect and keep it as a controller. However, once you have it connected, it won't actually do anything at all. So none of these inputs will actually register. But it does leave me wondering whether or not this is something that might be able to be updated with a firmware update down the line. And it's the same thing with my iPhone. I can pair no problem in Bluetooth mode with the controller, but when it comes to actually using the controller, nothing gets detected. And 8BitDo has pushed out firmware updates in the past that have expanded its compatibility, so I'm hoping that something like this will be coming down the line. Either way, when it comes to iPhone and iPad, the GameSir controller will just work with no further update. It's going to be similar to connecting with a PC, so you'll press the B and then the chicken button, and then after that you'll go into your Bluetooth settings and then connect it, and then you will be good to go. And the connection here also worked very well, so all of my Apple games worked just fine. Same thing with old retro games via RetroArch. And there is one last system the GameSir controller will work with that the 8BitDo will not, so let's move on to Nintendo Switch. Now to get this set up, it's going to be similar like it is with any other third-party controller, so you'll go into the controller section and then select Change Grip/Order. Once you're in this menu, you'll press the top or the Y button plus the chicken button to start the Nintendo Switch pairing, and then once the red lights are flashing, you can press L and R and it should connect right away. And that's it, it's going to connect like a Nintendo Switch Pro controller, but just bear in mind that this is not going to have gyroscopic controls. Everything else worked just fine, including the rumble, and so if you're looking for a cheap Nintendo Switch Pro controller, this might work out well. However, one thing to bear in mind, this will not wake the Nintendo Switch up from sleep. So you're not going to be able to grab the controller and turn it on, and that's going to also turn on the Switch. Instead, you will have to physically go over to your Switch and tap on that little power button to get it to wake up. After that, it will pair just fine, and then you'll be able to jump into your game, but it is a bit of a bummer that it doesn't have that functionality because I think that's super handy. Okay, that's really about it when it comes to testing, so let's move on and start wrapping things up and talk about some of the similarities between these and then also some of the things that set them apart. I think we should start by talking about the similarities so that we have a baseline of what to expect with either of these controllers. Number one, these are just really solid controllers for the price, between $25 and $30 to get a lot of functionality and really good quality. They're also pretty lightweight, about 218 grams for the 8BitDo and 210 for the GameSir. And they both can connect to Windows and Linux via a wireless dongle or just a USB-C cable. In addition, you can use Bluetooth to connect to Android with each controller as well. And then finally, they have pretty similar battery life, about 20 hours of play depending on whether or not you're using the Wi-Fi dongle or Bluetooth. And Bluetooth will generally give you longer play, up to about 30 or 35 hours. So those are the things that are pretty similar between them. So let's now talk about some of the things that are different. We'll start with the Ultimate 2C. And I'm going to frame this as being advantages over the other and also disadvantages compared to the other. In terms of advantages for the 8BitDo 8BitDo controller, there are a few. The first is that it does have a higher pulling rate, about 1000 Hz when using it wired or with the USB dongle. By comparison, the Nova Lite is only about 250 Hz as far as I've read. Theoretically, this means that the 8BitDo controller should have lower input latency compared to the GameSir controller. In addition, the 8BitDo controller comes with a USB cable, so if you need one of those to charge your controller, it's going to come with it already. In addition, I do also think that the 8BitDo is just a little bit more premium feeling altogether. It's got a metal band around the analog stick, and it also has Hall sensor triggers which feel really nice and smooth. Now, there are a couple disadvantages compared to the Nova Lite. The first is that the D-pad just doesn't seem like a really great fit for retro gaming, and it's especially disappointing given the fact that the previous 8BitDo Ultimate models were actually wonderful for retro games. And then finally, in terms of wireless connectivity, you don't have a lot of options. For example, you cannot get a Bluetooth connection right now with any Apple, Nintendo Switch, Windows, or Linux device. So you are going to be limited to just wired connectivity, the USB dongle, and then also Bluetooth for Android only. Now let's talk about the Nova Lite, and this also has quite a few advantages. The first, of course, is going to be that Bluetooth connectivity that the Ultimate does not have. In addition, it has a hard shell carrying case, and most importantly, it has a dongle holder inside. And for that fact alone, I do think the GameSir is going to be a more travel-friendly controller. It's also $5 cheaper than the 8BitDo Ultimate 2C. It's only $25 altogether for this entire controller. But it is not perfect, and it has a couple disadvantages compared to the 8BitDo. The first is that it does not come with a cable, and so if you need to charge your controller, you're going to have to bring your own. In addition, if you want to have Hall sensor triggers, this doesn't have them. Personally, I've never experienced trigger drift, but if you have, that might be something worth looking into. And then finally, I did find it a little bit weird that the wireless dongle for mine, after doing a firmware update, would only go into Nintendo Switch Pro mode. Hopefully this is something that we'll see in a future software update. So in summary, when it comes down to it, if I had to choose between one controller or the other, I'm pretty sure by now you know which one I prefer. I think the 8BitDo is an excellent controller. It's pretty crazy that for $30 we have something that feels so premium and has Hall sensor sticks as well as triggers. I also like that we have a bunch of different color options. Even this green and orange one still looks pretty cool. However, I think that within the 8BitDo Ultimate line, it is in your best interest to save up just a little bit more money and get one of the controllers that have a dock, because I think that's a very convenient advantage, although it will cost you quite a bit more. So when it comes down to it, if I had a budget of only $30 between the two, I would just pick up the GameSir for $25. And after spending that $25, I'd have $5 left over to go and buy my favorite snack or drink. In addition, you're going to get an awesome controller with the Nova Lite. I love the fact that this is a $25 jack of all trades. I can connect it to just about every single device I have within my house. And I think from just that pure value proposition of having the most bang for my buck, the GameSir is going to win every time. At the end of the day, these are not the best controllers out there. After all, they're very cheap. But I also love the fact that for $30 or less, we can jump right into an excellent gaming experience. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick up one of these really cheap controllers, or do you think it's better to save up your money and get something that's just a little bit better, even if it does cost twice as much? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.